Hey guys, I've been shooting the east coast of Australia and the coast in particular for about 20 years now, and I just wanted to do a video giving you my tips for shooting awesome seascapes. Tip number one, long exposures are actually quite short. What do I mean by that? Basically, when I first started, I thought I had to do 5 seconds, 10 seconds or something, and that was what constituted a long exposure. But in terms of capturing movement in water, it certainly is not that long. When I'm out photographing waves on the rocks, I found the sweet spot to be anything around half a second at f11. And obviously, if you're shooting in bright daylight conditions, you'll have to put a neutral density filter on the front of the camera so that you can stop the lens down to those sort of apertures in order to get the slower exposures correctly exposed. When you are shooting those exposures, bear in mind that your camera might be moving, and so whilst the in-camera stabilization and in-lens stabilization is really good, particularly on more modern cameras, you'll probably get your best shots by sticking the camera on a tripod. If you are shooting on a tripod, then try and use the 2-second timer or a remote trigger of some kind. In terms of what you're photographing, splashes are of course brilliant, but don't forget about the backwash. Quite often you find that as the water is receding over the back of a rock, you get these beautiful textures from the white water flowing through the crevices and the crooks and crannies of those particular rocks. And if you are photographing the waves, that probably means you're very close to the water, and you should always keep an eye out for the cleanup sets, those 50 to 100th waves that come in, which are 2 to 3 times the size of all the preceding waves and can quite easily flush you and all your camera equipment out to sea. If you can, put a circular polarizer on with your ND filter. If you're shooting those longish exposures, you can play around with the reflections and the contrast of the scene by setting the circular polarizer in the right direction, oriented to the sun. Number 2, reflections can be your friend. Some of my best shots have made heavy use of reflections. Now, this is partly because my local beach is very well suited to that, but I just love the way they look too. Obviously, these work best with wet sand, particularly if there's a lot of it at low tide, but you can get some really nice reflections in the rock pools too. So always pay attention to how things look as you're setting up your shot. If you are lucky enough to have a sandy beach with quite a gradual slope off out to the ocean rather than a sudden drop off, then you can get some beautiful reflections in the wet sand, which turns almost mirror-like. And to really accentuate those reflections, my top tip is to get the camera as low as possible. And to really make those reflections pop, remember to bring your circular polarizer and tune it so that you've got the maximum amount of reflectivity in that sand. I love the simple, plain reflective shots on the sand with the sunset or sunrise reflected in that mirror-like surface. But I've also found that it's often nice to have some kind of interest elsewhere in the shot. Sometimes that presents itself naturally in terms of a surfer or a fisherman or something like that. But sometimes I've been known to stick it on a 10-second timer and put myself in the shot. Number 3, natural is great, but man-made is too. So when I first started photographing the coast, I was quite particular about what I included in my shots, and I tried not to include any man-made structures that might have been present. I know that some people in the photographic community are quite snobbish about this stuff, and they just don't like seeing anything man-made, whatever it might be, in a landscape photo. So my tip about this is just to please yourself, and if there's some attractive man-made structure that you can make use of in your photography, then do so. Things that I found that work particularly well for this are things like wharfs and jetties, and here on the coastline in Australia we've got quite a few interesting wrecks, which are of course perfect subjects for photography. And we've also got some remnants of industrial equipment, old sort of mine workings, railway equipment and that sort of stuff. So just keep an eye out for that, and you can often make it the focal point of your photograph. Number 4, those in the know get low. Some of my favourite shots that I've taken at the coast, my coastal seascape shots, were ones that I took really low down to the ground. So instead of shooting everything at eye level, particularly if you've got a flip out screen on your camera, make use of it. Put the camera down nice and low, compose a shot, and you can get a completely different and often extremely nice perspective. If you're on a sandy beach, then look over your shoulder and you'll often find some really cool places to put the camera in that immediate coastal fringe on the edge of the dunes with the dune grass and the shrubs and bushes and that kind of thing. You can of course do that with the tripod, getting down nice and low. Most tripods have a function whereby you can collapse the legs outwards, but also don't be afraid to take the camera off the tripod and just shoot handheld. When you're thinking of compositions for your shots, remember to look for natural frames in the environment. So this is things like bushes and the gaps between them, or rocks and the gaps between those, but it can be anything really. It's just a great way of centering the subject of your shot and drawing people's eyes into it. And if you are shooting a shot that has some sort of natural frame, then also experiment with the aperture. It's obviously nice to have that crisp image, edge to edge, sort of f8, f11 or something like that. But just try a wide open aperture. Stick it down at f4 or lower if your lens will do it, and see what happens when you kind of blur out the edges of the frame or the subject in front. I've lost track of what number we're up to, but this particular tip is don't be afraid to wing it. So all I have to say about this is that don't stress too much about meticulously composing every shot you take. I know a lot of people stress about this, and I've touched on it in some of my other videos. It's not a style of photography that I particularly like or enjoy. There's nothing wrong with it if you like composing your shots and getting very sort of strict about it, but I'm just suggesting that maybe you try and improvise occasionally and see what you come up with. The cameras we have these days are so versatile, and people tend to use them in quite rigid ways. You know, there's this kind of landscape model we all must subscribe to, where we think about the rule of thirds and the golden ratio and carefully compose our shot on a tripod, and thou shalt use an ND filter under these conditions. Well, I'm saying bollocks to all that. Go with the flow, do what you know, and just experiment. Be ready to capture nature. When you're at the coast, there is a high possibility that an interesting critter or two might appear in the environment you're in. I'm lucky enough to live on the east coast of Australia, and we have some amazing creatures here. But when I first started going out and shooting seascapes, I was woefully unprepared to photograph them if they appeared. So make sure you familiarise yourself with quickly switching modes so that you don't miss out on some amazing wildlife shots while you're shooting your seascapes. Remember also that you can make use of those critters. I love nothing better than putting things like seabirds in my shots. I've done quite a few images down on the sands on my local beach where the birds have been a perfect focal point for an image. Now the important thing of course when you're shooting critters like seabirds is that they're very easy to spook. And typically I found that I can get sort of about 20 meters away from them before they decide that I'm too close, and then they fly away. If you are trying to get a bird in your shot, remember just to inch forward slowly, and you might find they're more cooperative than you imagined. Don't be afraid to shoot into the sun. Now I'm not suggesting that you damage the sensor on your camera by focusing in on the sun, zooming in and doing a long exposure or anything silly like that. But what I'm saying is that people stress about this and shy away from photographing into the sun. But some of the best shots I've taken over the years, the ones I love the most in fact, are when I have been shooting directly in towards the full sun. Not right at it, but towards it. When you do this, the shot will become quite monochromatic, and you can use this to great effect, particularly if there's something or someone else in the shot. So if you're at the beach or on the coastline and you see the setting sun, don't be afraid to shoot backwards on yourself down the coast, particularly if there's something like a fisherman in the shot. You can get some really cool images that way. So when you're taking your landscape photos, it's often important to be aware of your intention for that shot before you begin. Now, I'm not talking about the aforementioned composition. I'm talking about what your aim is for it. Is this a full-blown landscape shot, or are you shooting something that's more lifestyle? If you're shooting a lifestyle shot, perhaps for Instagram, then it really doesn't matter where you go, because most of those kinds of shots, it's really hard to identify where it is. And quite often when I see a lifestyle shot taken on a beach and it has the location, I think to myself, well, it could be anywhere. However, if the intention of the seascape you're taking is a full-blown landscape photo, then you need to make it plain in the shot which beach you're photographing. You need to photograph it in such a way that if someone was to look at it, who might have visited that beach, they go, oh yes, I recognize it. So try and pick out what the distinctive feature of that beach is. What makes that beach different to all the others? How can I photograph this beach in such a way that it's completely clear where it is? Okay, my next tip for Seascapes is about drones, which are of course absolutely brilliant tools for photographing this particular environment. You do, however, have to accentuate the drone's key strength when it comes to landscape photography, which is of course perspective. So don't be afraid to fly your drone out over the water. The modern drones that are available now, particularly the DJI ones, are extremely reliable bits of kit, and it will almost certainly be absolutely fine as long as you don't do anything crazy like flying it into a wave. So put the drone out over the water and shoot back towards the land for a really awesome perspective. If the oceans aren't too crazy, you can also bring it down fairly low to get some awesome perspectives, particularly in the surf break. If you're going for that crystal clear turquoise water, you will of course need to put a circular polarizer on the front of your drone's camera. One key thing to bear in mind when you're shooting seascapes is that the coastline is in a state of constant flux. It is always changing, and if you're going to a particular location to photograph a scene that you might have seen another photographer take, bear in mind you may not be able to replicate it or give your version of it. The sand on beaches is notorious for moving and shifting and covering things up, and for revealing them. Rocks crumble and fall into the ocean, and trees fall down too. So if you see a shot when you're out and about and you think, that's a really nice composition there, I should take it, then my advice to you is to not hang about and take that shot, because the next time you come back, it'll probably be completely different. A lot of my best seascapes were taken when the weather was absolutely lousy, and you shouldn't be afraid of hitting the coast when the conditions are slightly inclement. Clouds add mood and structure to shots, and you often get things like shafts of light coming through clouds. Changeable conditions when you're moving from a spell of nice weather into bad weather are often the best, because that's when you get the really cool cloud structures such as shelf clouds and storm fronts rolling in, which make brilliant photographic seascape subjects. If your equipment is weather sealed, then don't be afraid to let it get wet. Rain and mist often add a huge amount of mood to an image and perfectly offset the conditions on the coast where you're shooting your seascape. Now, of course, the coastline is a big environment, and often the best way of capturing that is with a panoramic shot. The problem is that unlike, say, a shot of a national park, the ocean is moving, and this makes it notoriously difficult to stitch together once you've taken your photographs. If you are shooting on a beach or a bit of coast in fairly close proximity to the breaking waves, then my advice is to pan in the direction the waves are breaking. If you do this right and time it correctly, and it takes a little bit of practice, then you find that you just get one continuous wave all across the shot, and your pano software will have no problem stitching it. So before you take your pano, pre-focus, choose a focal point for the image, and then pan quickly as you can across the image as the waves coming in. If you're shooting a pano of the coast with your drone, then often the waves are not the issue with those, because usually you're quite a long way away from them. The issue with those is usually the horizon. Often the horizon is quite uniform and homogeneous, and the pano software has a great deal of difficulty finding key points to match up so it can stitch them together. And usually the only way around that is to manually stitch it, or do some meticulous key pointing in the panoramic software you're using. Now, far and away the best lens for seascapes is definitely a wide angle lens, as wide as you can get preferably. But that doesn't mean you should exclusively use wide lenses. I've found that I can get some really stunning shots by sticking the old telephoto on the camera and zooming in. For instance, you can zoom down the beach to capture the waves and people walking on them and birds and that kind of stuff, or you might be shooting inside a bay and you can shoot across the bay to the cliffs on the other side. Quite often I will stick my largest telephoto on the camera and scan the ocean for boats and ships and that kind of stuff, which might not be visible to the human eye, and which you can capture really nice shots, particularly at sunrise or sunset. Now again, I know most people like shooting seascapes with a tripod so they can get a nice stable shot and do long exposures and that sort of thing, but I strongly suggest that you spend at least a bit of time when you're on the coast just hand holding and taking some shots that way. In most recent cameras they have brilliant in-body image stabilization, and the lenses often have stabilization too, and you would be amazed at the shots you can get away with hand holding. I've taken quite a few shots with my Fujifilm X-T4, handheld, 1/6 of a second, things like that, and nobody would know that it wasn't shot on a tripod. You can even get away with shooting handheld on older cameras, because if you want to, you can crank the ISO up. The coastal environment is quite granular by its nature, and you can get away with quite a high degree of noise in your images because you've got things like rocks and ocean waves and that kind of stuff, and the grain doesn't really matter. So don't be afraid of cranking the ISO up and shooting handheld if you want to. And my last tip is simply to go prepared. Always pack the mozzie spray, the sun lotion and some water. Particularly here in Australia, but I suspect around most bits of coastline, mosquitoes and flies are a bit of a problem, and I hate being down there and getting bitten to death. So I always have a little tube of mosquito spray in my bag alongside my suntan lotion so I don't get sunburnt, and I always have some water because usually I'm quite a long way from the car and a source of drinking water. So that wraps up this video, guys. I hope you get a chance to go out and photograph some coastline near you really soon. If you do, I hope that my tips have proven useful to you and that you get some amazing shots to add to the collection. Considered? Blah, blah, blah. What? Should we do this whole bit again? Bloody screensaver. You want to talk to me? See, blah, blah, blah.
Hello.
Number, I don't know. I've lost track. We won't do numbers from now on. Sorry. Another burp. Excuse me.